Christmas. It's a time of light, laughter, and togetherness. But in the stillness of a snowy night, when the world falls silent, the shadows seem to grow longer, and the stories whispered in the dark take on a life of their own. Welcome to Mystera Shadows. Tonight, I'll guide you through chilling tales that will make you see this holiday season in a different light. Let the warmth of your blankets keep you safe as the cold truths of these stories unfold. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the quiet of the night carry you into a place where mystery and wonder collide. Sleep peacefully if you can. Looking back, I should have felt it the moment I stepped onto the property. There was something in the air, an unnatural stillness that didn't belong, even in the depths of winter. It wasn't just the biting cold, or the way the snow blanketed everything in an eerie silence. It was deeper than that. Subtle at first, like the faint sensation of being watched from the shadows. But I ignored it, chalking it up to the isolation and the weight of old memories that seemed to linger in every corner of the house. The family home had always been a place of contradictions for me. During the day, it was charming in its worn simplicity, the kind of place that looked like it belonged on the cover of a Christmas postcard. The weathered clapboards, the faint smell of pine from the surrounding trees, and the way the windows fogged up from the warmth of a crackling fire, all of it felt idyllic. But at night, the charm faded. The house took on a different character under the weight of darkness. The corners seemed darker, the creaks louder, the wind outside more mournful. The first night, I was determined to settle in. The snowstorm outside was relentless, thick flakes piling up against the windowsills and muffling any sound from the outside world. I lit the fireplace, its light flickering across the walls, and strung up a few strands of Christmas lights to give the place a cozy, festive feel. The soft glow helped, at least for a little while. But no matter how much I tried to focus on unpacking or reading by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It began just after midnight. I had been sitting by the fire, half drifting in and out of sleep, when I first heard it, a faint melody carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just the storm, the howl of the wind bending through the trees in a way that mimicked sound. But as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't random. It was a song, slow and deliberate, with a haunting quality that made my skin crawl. I stood and moved toward the window, peering out into the darkness. The snow was falling heavily, blanketing the clearing in white, but something caught my eye. At the edge of the property, where the driveway met the tree line, stood a group of figures. There were 5 or 6 of them, their shapes barely visible through the swirling snow. They were standing perfectly still, their forms cloaked in long coats with hoods that obscured their faces. Each one held a small lantern, the light casting faint, flickering shadows across the snow. They were singing. The melody wasn't anything I recognized, but there was something about it that felt old, ancient even. The harmonies were unnervingly precise, the voices blending together in a way that didn't feel entirely human. I couldn't make out any of the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't joyful or celebratory, the way Christmas carols were meant to be. It was mournful, almost pleading, like a dirge for something long lost. My breath fogged the glass as I stared at them, a strange mix of fear and curiosity rooting me to the spot. They didn't move, didn't gesture or react to the storm around them. They just stood there, singing their haunting melody, their lanterns swaying faintly in the wind. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the singing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. The figures remained still for a moment longer, and then, one by one, they began to turn. Their movements were slow and deliberate, almost mechanical, as they turned away from the house and disappeared into the trees. I stayed at the window long after they were gone, staring at the empty clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe some kind of odd local tradition, A group of carolers who had decided to brave the storm for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. There had been something wrong about them, something that didn't belong. I went to bed that night with the sound of their song echoing in my ears. It stayed with me even as I drifted into a restless sleep, the melody threading through my dreams like a shadow. I dreamed of the figures standing at the edge of the clearing, their lanterns flickering faintly as they watched the house. But in the dream, they weren't standing still. They were moving, slowly but steadily, their feet crunching in the snow as they came closer. I woke with a start. The image of their hooded forms burned into my mind. The fire had gone out, leaving the room in a cold, oppressive darkness. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but the house was silent. The storm outside had died down, the wind reduced to a faint whisper against the windows. For a moment, I almost believed it had all been a dream. But when I went to the window and looked outside, the snow told a different story. There were footprints. They started at the edge of the clearing, where I had seen the figures the night before, and led all the way to the front porch. My breath caught in my throat as I followed their path with my eyes, my stomach sinking when I realized where they ended. Right outside the front door. The sight of them filled me with a deep, gnawing dread. The prints were fresh, their edges sharp and defined against the pristine snow, but there was no sign of anyone else. The clearing was empty, the tree line silent and still. And then, as I stood there, staring out at the snow, I noticed something else. The prints didn't lead away. Whoever, or whatever, had made them hadn't left. I stayed by the window longer than I should have, staring at the footprints. The cold from the glass seeped into my skin, but I couldn't pull myself away. My mind raced, struggling to find a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. The footprints stopped at the door. No returning tracks, no sign of retreat. Whoever had been out there hadn't left. Or worse, they were still here. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I grabbed a heavy coat and a flashlight, trying to summon the courage to step outside and see for myself. The air was biting as I opened the door, a sharp gust of wind stinging my face as I stepped onto the porch. The world outside was unnervingly quiet. The snow reflected the pale light of the moon, casting an ethereal glow over the clearing, but the tree line loomed dark and foreboding in the distance. The footprints were clearer up close. They were deep, pressed into the snow with an almost unnatural precision. My stomach turned as I knelt to examine them, the edges of each print too sharp, too defined. They didn't look like the prints of boots or shoes. There was something off about the shape, the way the snow seemed to sink unnaturally beneath the weight of them. I stood and followed the trail back to the edge of the clearing, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam wavered as my hands shook, the fear creeping up my spine with every step. But when I reached the tree line, the trail ended abruptly. The footprints simply stopped, as if whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. The snow beyond was untouched, pristine. The forest felt alive, the shadows between the trees shifting as though they were watching me. The air here was colder, heavier, pressing against my chest and making it hard to breathe. I didn't stay long. Something about the stillness felt wrong, as though I wasn't supposed to be here. I turned back toward the cabin, my footsteps crunching loudly in the snow, the sound unnervingly sharp in the silence. When I reached the porch, I hesitated before going inside. The warmth of the cabin should have been inviting, comforting, but instead, it felt like a trap. The door stood open, the soft glow of the fireplace casting long shadows across the floor. I stepped inside, bolting the door behind me, and leaned against it, my breath fogging the air as I tried to steady myself. The house was quiet, but not in the way it should have been. It was the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I moved through the rooms slowly, checking every door, every window, but everything was as it should be. Nothing had been disturbed. And yet, the feeling of being watched lingered. a weight pressing against my back with every step. I tried to distract myself, lighting more candles and turning on the small string of Christmas lights I'd strung across the mantel. The soft glow filled the room, casting a warm, flickering light that should have chased away the unease. But the warmth felt hollow, like it didn't belong. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, the sound of the crackling wood doing little to calm my nerves. And then, just as the tension began to ease, I heard it. The singing. It started faint, almost imperceptible, threading through the silence like a whisper. I froze, my heart pounding as I strained to listen. The melody was the same as before, slow and haunting, but it was closer now, more distinct. The voices rose and fell in perfect harmony, blending together in a way that felt unnatural, otherworldly. I moved to the window, peering out into the clearing. The tree line was still, the snow undisturbed, but the singing grew louder, more insistent. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw them. The figures stood in the clearing again, their lanterns glowing faintly in the darkness. They were closer this time, no longer at the edge of the property, but halfway to the cabin. My breath caught in my throat as I counted them. 7 in total, their forms tall and cloaked in shadow. They stood perfectly still, their hoods obscuring their faces, but I could feel their gaze, heavy and unrelenting, fixed on the house. The singing continued, the melody weaving through the night like a thread being pulled taut. It wasn't beautiful or comforting. It was cold, mournful, a sound that crawled under my skin and settled deep in my chest. I wanted to look away, to close the curtains and shut them out, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked on them, my body frozen as the fear took hold. And then, as if sensing my attention, one of the figures raised its arm. The motion was slow, deliberate, as it pointed directly at me. My stomach dropped, the air leaving my lungs in a sharp gasp. The singing grew louder, the voices rising in a haunting crescendo that seemed to echo inside my head. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing as the fear overwhelmed me. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, they were gone. The clearing was empty, the snow undisturbed, as though they had never been there. But the singing didn't stop. It lingered in the air, faint and distorted, threading through the walls of the house like a phantom. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The fear was too great, the sense of wrongness too overwhelming. I sat by the fire, staring at the door, the poker clutched tightly in my hands. The singing faded as the hours passed, replaced by an oppressive silence that was somehow worse. And then, just before dawn, I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside the window. They were back. The sound of footsteps haunted me long after the dawn arrived. They weren't hurried or frantic, but steady, deliberate. Each step seemed to echo with purpose, a cadence that didn't belong to the aimless wandering of an animal or the hurried retreat of some prankster. No, these steps carried intent. When the sun finally rose, its weak light barely cutting through the thick gray sky, I forced myself to step outside. The footprints were there again, leading from the forest's edge to the porch, but this time they were joined by another set. 2 sets of prints, side by side, both stopping just short of the front door. My stomach twisted at the sight. Whatever was happening wasn't random. It was growing, spreading. The clearing was silent, the air around me heavy with an unnatural stillness. The forest loomed in the distance, its dark branches twisting against the pale sky like skeletal fingers. I followed the tracks to where they disappeared into the trees, stopping just at the edge of the shadows. My breath fogged the air as I peered into the woods, straining to see past the first few rows of trees. There was nothing, just the faint rustle of branches swaying in the wind. But I could feel it, the weight of something unseen watching me. It pressed against my back, heavy and unrelenting, urging me to turn around, to leave the forest behind. I didn't dare step any closer. Whatever was waiting in those trees wasn't something I wanted to face. Back inside the cabin, the atmosphere felt no less oppressive. The faint warmth of the fireplace did little to chase away the chill that had settled in my bones, and every creak of the old wooden floors set my nerves on edge. I moved through the house aimlessly, trying to distract myself with chores, but nothing could shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the day wore on, the light outside grew dimmer, the pale gray of the sky fading to an ominous blue. The snow began to fall again, thick flakes swirling lazily past the windows. By the time night fell, the world outside was shrouded in white, the clearing barely visible through the steady curtain of snow. I tried to prepare myself for what was coming. Deep down, I knew they would return. The thought filled me with a deep, gnawing dread, but there was nowhere to go. The roads were impassable, the nearest town miles away. I was trapped here, alone, with whatever was lurking in the dark. It started just after sunset. The first notes of their song drifted through the air, faint and distorted, carried on the wind like a distant echo. I froze where I stood, my heart pounding as the melody grew louder, the voices blending together in that same haunting harmony. They were closer this time. I could feel it. I moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see into the clearing. The lanterns came into view first, their faint glow cutting through the snow like fireflies in the dark. And then the figures appeared, stepping into the clearing one by one, their movements slow and deliberate. There were more of them now. 10, maybe 12, their hooded forms shrouded in shadow. They formed a circle in the center of the clearing, their lanterns swaying gently as they began their song. The melody was different this time, its tone more urgent, more insistent. It wasn't just a song, it was a call. I stepped back from the window, my pulse racing as the sound filled the cabin, threading through the walls like smoke. It was everywhere, reverberating in my chest, sinking into my skin. I clutched the fireplace poker, my knuckles white, and stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. But the door didn't move. The singing continued, growing louder, more intense, until it felt like the very air was vibrating with the force of it. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there, frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I waited for something, anything, to happen. And then I heard it. A single, deliberate knock at the door. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was so soft, I almost didn't hear it over the sound of my own heartbeat. But it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. And then another. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, each one reverberating through the silence like a death knell. I backed away from the door, clutching the poker tightly as the knocks continued, growing louder, more urgent. The lantern light outside the window flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The air in the cabin felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence that pressed against me from all sides. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving the cabin in an oppressive silence. I stood there, my body trembling, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. And then I saw it, a shadow, moving across the frosted glass of the window. It wasn't the flicker of a lantern or the sway of the snow-laden branches. It was deliberate, slow, as though someone or something was moving just outside, circling the house. My breath caught in my throat as I followed the shadow's path, watching as it disappeared from one window, only to reappear at another. The whispers began again, faint at first, threading through the air like a distant breeze. They weren't coming from outside. They were inside, seeping through the walls, the floor, the very air I was breathing. The words were indistinct, a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest, but I didn't need to understand them to know what they meant. They were calling for me. I don't remember moving, but suddenly I was at the window, my hand pressed against the frosted glass as I stared out into the clearing. The figures were gone. The lanterns had vanished, their light extinguished. But the footprints were still there, leading from the clearing to the porch, their sharp edges etched into the fresh snow. And then, as I watched, the first footprint appeared on the porch. It pressed into the snow with an unnatural precision, its edges sharp and defined as though it had been stamped into the surface. And then another appeared. And another. They were coming toward the door. I stumbled back, the poker slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The whispers grew louder, their tone more urgent, more insistent. The air in the cabin seemed to hum with their energy, vibrating with a force that made my teeth ache. And then, just as the footsteps reached the door, the lanterns flared to life outside the window, their light casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. And the singing began again. The singing didn't stop. It grew louder, filling every corner of the cabin, the melody twisting and distorting in ways that made my chest tighten. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing, and clutched the poker like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. The lantern light outside flared brighter, casting jagged, shifting shadows across the walls, and with each flicker, I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing against me. I didn't know what to do. Running wasn't an option. The snow outside was too deep, the roads impassable. I was trapped, caught between the suffocating walls of the cabin and the growing presence of whatever was outside. My breath fogged the air as I tried to steady myself, but the song burrowed deeper into my mind, its haunting melody threading through my thoughts like a dark vine. And then I heard it, a low creak, the unmistakable sound of wood bending under weight. The porch. They were on the porch. My stomach twisted as I turned toward the door. The lantern light outside dimmed, and the singing shifted, the voices overlapping in a dissonant harmony that made my skin crawl. The creaking grew louder, more deliberate, as if something, or someone, was pacing back and forth just beyond the threshold. I forced myself to move, stepping closer to the door, the poker trembling in my hand. The whispers began again, threading through the melody of the song, their guttural tones blending into the background like a ghostly echo. I couldn't understand the words, but the intent behind them was clear. They weren't just singing. They were calling me. The door rattled. It wasn't a knock this time. It was a slow, deliberate push, the wood groaning under the pressure. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as the air in the cabin seemed to grow heavier, thicker, pressing against my chest like a weight. The singing swelled, drowning out everything else, and I realized with a sinking dread that they were coming in. The lantern light outside extinguished all at once, plunging the clearing into darkness. The shadows in the cabin stretched longer, twisting unnaturally across the walls, and the air grew so cold that my breath came out in thick, ragged clouds. I gripped the poker tighter, my knuckles white, and took another step back, my eyes locked on the door. It swung open slowly, the hinges groaning as the freezing wind rushed inside. Snow swirled across the floor, glinting faintly in the dim firelight, and for a moment there was nothing but darkness beyond the threshold. And then I saw them. The figures stepped into the cabin one by one, their movements slow and deliberate. There were 5 of them, their hooded forms towering in the flickering light. They didn't speak, didn't make a sound beyond the soft crunch of snow beneath their feet. But the air around them seemed to hum with energy, vibrating with a force that made the walls tremble and the fire sputter. I stumbled back further, my breath hitching as they moved closer. Their faces, or where their faces should have been, were hidden beneath the shadows of their hoods, but I could feel their gaze, heavy and unrelenting, pressing into me like a physical weight. The song had stopped, replaced by a silence so thick it seemed to wrap around me like a shroud. One of the figures raised an arm, its hand emerging from the folds of its cloak. The fingers were long and skeletal, the skin stretched taut over jagged bone, and they pointed directly at me. My knees buckled, and I gripped the edge of the table for support, my eyes wide as the figure tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate. And then, without a word, it turned and gestured toward the window. I followed its motion, my stomach sinking as I saw what lay outside. Clearing was filled with them. Dozens of hooded figures, their lanterns glowing faintly in the dark, their forms barely visible through the falling snow. They stood in a perfect circle, their movements synchronized as they began to sway in unison. The singing started again. It was different this time. The melody was darker, more urgent, the voices rising and falling in a dissonant harmony that made my ears ring. The figures inside the cabin joined in, their heads tilting back as their song echoed through the room, threading through the very walls like a living thing. I couldn't move. The sound rooted me to the spot, its weight pressing down on me like a physical force. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, moving in ways that didn't match the flicker of the firelight, and the air in the cabin grew colder, the frost creeping across the windows in jagged patterns. And then the whispers returned. They were louder now, more distinct, their guttural tones cutting through the song like a knife. I couldn't understand the words, but they seemed to echo inside my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts with a suffocating weight. The figures moved closer, their cloaks brushing against the floor as they circled around me, their voices blending into the melody of the song. I closed my eyes, clutching the poker like it was the only thing tethering me to reality, and tried to block out the sound. But it was everywhere, threading through my mind, burrowing deep into my chest. The weight of their presence pressed against me from all sides, and I felt the cold creeping up my legs, numbing my skin as the shadows closed in. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the singing stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. When I opened my eyes, the figures were gone. The cabin was empty, the fire reduced to a faint glow of embers, and the snow outside had stopped, leaving the clearing bathed in an eerie pale light. But the feeling of being watched lingered, heavier than ever, and I knew deep down that they weren't finished. They were waiting. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, a tangible weight pressing down on me as I sat frozen by the dying fire. My breath fogged the air, the cold creeping in from every corner, as if the walls themselves were pulling the heat away. The figures were gone, but their presence lingered, heavy and unrelenting, seeping into the very fabric of the room. I could still feel them, just beyond the edges of the light, waiting for the darkness to return. I told myself to move, to stoke the fire, and bring warmth back into the room, but my body refused to cooperate. The poker lay on the floor where I had dropped it, useless now against whatever had entered my home. My gaze flickered to the frost-covered windows, the jagged patterns glinting faintly in the dim light. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement beyond the glass, a shadow shifting in the pale glow of the snow. But when I blinked, it was gone. The whispers started again, faint and distant, threading through the silence like a poisonous mist. They were no longer outside. They were inside, weaving through the air, pressing against my skin, filling my lungs with every breath. I couldn't understand the words, but their intent was clear. They weren't just watching me. They were calling me. The lanterns flared to life outside the window, their pale glow casting eerie, shifting shadows across the walls. The frost on the glass began to melt, the patterns dripping like tears, and through the thinning frost, I saw them. The figures stood in the clearing, their hoods pulled low, their lanterns swaying gently in the wind. But they weren't standing still anymore. They were moving. The circle broke as they began to walk, their movements slow and deliberate, their footsteps crunching softly in the snow. They moved toward the cabin in perfect unison, their lanterns bobbing in time with their steps, and as they approached, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. My chest tightened as I watched them, the air in the room growing colder with each passing second. And then they stopped. The figures stood at the edge of the porch, their lanterns casting faint, flickering light across the wooden planks. The whispers ceased, leaving a deafening silence in their wake, and for a moment, nothing happened. I held my breath, my hands gripping the arms of the chair, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might shatter the stillness. And then, from the darkness beyond the door, came the first note. The singing returned, soft and low, barely more than a hum, but it carried an otherworldly weight that sent shivers down my spine. The melody twisted and shifted, rising and falling in dissonant harmonies that seemed to resonate in my very bones. It wasn't just a song. It was a command. The door creaked open. I don't remember unlocking it. I don't even remember moving. But as the cold air rushed into the room, carrying with it the faint scent of frost and decay, I realized I was no longer in control. My body moved on its own, rising from the chair, my steps slow and mechanical as I approached the door. The figures stood just beyond the threshold, their faces hidden beneath the shadows of their hoods, their lanterns casting long, twisting shadows across the floor. One of them stepped forward, its movements impossibly smooth, almost gliding across the ground. It raised a hand, the skeletal fingers curling into a gesture that could only be described as beckoning. I wanted to resist, to scream, to slam the door shut and lock myself away from whatever nightmare I had stepped into. But I couldn't. The song was inside me now, threading through my thoughts, pulling me forward like a puppet on a string. I stepped outside. The cold hit me like a wall, sharp and biting, stealing the breath from my lungs. The figures formed a circle around me, their lanterns swaying in time with the melody, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the snow beneath my feet shifting like quicksand. The whispers returned, louder now, blending with the song in a cacophony of sound that made my head spin. And then, the figures began to move. They led me to the center of the clearing, their movements slow and deliberate, their lanterns casting strange, flickering patterns across the snow. The air grew heavier with each step, the weight of their presence pressing against me like a physical force. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The song consumed everything, leaving no room for fear or resistance. There was only the melody, pulling me deeper into the dark. In the center of the clearing stood a single tree, its branches bare, its trunk twisted and blackened as if by fire. The snow around it was undisturbed, untouched by the footprints that had brought us here. The figures formed a circle around the tree, their lanterns flaring brighter. And as the light grew, the whispers reached a fever pitch, their guttural tones echoing through the clearing like a chant. One of the figures stepped forward, its skeletal hand reaching for mine. I wanted to pull away, to run, to do anything but follow. But my body no longer obeyed me. The hand was cold, impossibly cold, its touch burning like ice as it led me to the base of the tree. The others followed, their song rising in a haunting crescendo that drowned out the sound of the wind, the creak of the branches, the pounding of my heart. The ground beneath the tree began to shift, the snow melting away to reveal the dark, gnarled roots twisting like veins through the frozen earth. The figure released my hand and stepped back, its hood tilting downward as if bowing in reverence. The song reached its climax, the voices blending into a single, unearthly note that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. And then, everything went still. The silence was absolute, heavier than anything I had ever experienced. I stood there, my breath fogging the air, my body trembling as the weight of their gaze pressed down on me. The figures raised their lanterns in unison, their light illuminating the tree in a pale, otherworldly glow. And then, from the darkness of its twisted branches, something moved. The last thing I remember is the sound of the singing, faint and distorted, as the shadows closed in around me. It began with the first snow of December. I remember standing by the window, watching as the flakes fell in soft, relentless waves, blanketing the world in a hushed stillness. The kind of stillness that felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. The neighborhood was quiet, the houses lined with flickering Christmas lights that glowed faintly against the gray sky. It should have felt comforting, peaceful even. But as I stood there, staring out at the pristine snow, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The package appeared that morning, sitting on the front porch like it had been left there in a hurry. I almost missed it at first. It was small, wrapped in festive paper with a shiny red bow, and looked like it belonged under a Christmas tree rather than on my doorstep. There was no return address, no postage stamps, just a tag tied neatly to the ribbon, the words written in an elegant looping script, from the gift giver. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was from a neighbor, some kind of holiday gesture. But as I picked it up, I noticed how cold it was. Not the kind of cold you'd expect from something left outside in the snow, but a deep, unnatural chill that seeped into my skin. It made me hesitate, the weight of the box in my hands heavier than it should have been. But curiosity got the better of me. The paper tore easily under my fingers, revealing a plain, unmarked box underneath. When I opened it, I found a bracelet inside. It was old, the metal tarnished and dull, the once delicate engraving barely visible beneath years of wear. It didn't look valuable, just a simple, worn piece of jewelry that seemed out of place in its festive wrapping. I turned it over in my hands, searching for some kind of clue as to its origin, but there was nothing. No note, no explanation. Just the bracelet and that single cryptic tag. I should have thrown it away. I should have left it on the porch, forgotten it, moved on. But instead, I slipped it onto my wrist, the cold metal biting against my skin. It didn't fit perfectly, too loose, sliding up and down my arm with every movement, but something about it felt familiar, like it belonged there. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though the unease lingered. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just the strangeness of receiving an anonymous gift. By the time evening fell, I had almost managed to forget about it. Almost. The first sign that something was wrong came that night. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from upstairs. At first I thought it was the wind, the branches of the old oak tree brushing against the window. But as I stood there, listening, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't random. It was methodical. Tap, dot, ot. Tap, dot, pow. Tap, dot, o. Like someone knocking, soft but insistent. I turned off the faucet, the silence that followed so absolute it made my ears ring. The tapping continued, echoing faintly through the house, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I set the dish aside and wiped my hands on a towel, my movements slow and deliberate as I stepped out of the kitchen. The hallway was dark, the faint glow of the Christmas lights outside casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. I hesitated at the foot of the stairs, my breath fogging the cold air as I listened. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the house was silent. I stood there, my heart pounding, waiting for the sound to return. But it didn't. The stillness stretched on, heavy and oppressive, pressing against my chest like a weight. And then, just as I began to convince myself it was nothing, I heard it again. This time, it came from the living room. The sound was different now, softer, like the faint rustle of fabric or the creak of a floorboard under weight. My hands trembled as I reached for the light switch, the warm glow spilling into the hallway as I stepped toward the living room. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights twinkling softly, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. Everything looked as it should have, peaceful, ordinary. But then I saw it, the box. It was sitting on the coffee table, perfectly centered, its shiny red bow catching the light. My stomach dropped. I had left it in the kitchen. I was sure of it. The sight of it sitting there, so deliberate, so out of place, sent a jolt of fear through me. I approached it slowly, my hands trembling as I picked it up. The box was heavier this time, the chill emanating from it sharper, more pronounced. I opened it with shaking fingers, my breath hitching as I saw what lay inside. The bracelet. It sat there, nestled against the crumpled tissue paper, as if it had never left. But it wasn't the same. The metal was darker now, the tarnish spreading like ink across its surface. The delicate engraving was gone, replaced by deep, jagged scratches that marred the once smooth surface. My pulse quickened as I reached for it, the cold metal burning against my fingertips as I held it up to the light. That's when I saw it. My name. It was etched into the inside of the bracelet, the letters sharp and uneven, as though they had been carved by a trembling hand. I dropped it, the sound of the metal hitting the floor echoing through the silent room. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping started again. This time, it was louder, closer. Coming from the window behind me, I turned slowly, my body trembling as I faced the dark glass. The reflection of the room stared back at me, the faint glow of the Christmas lights casting a warm halo around the tree. But there was something else. A shadow, a figure, standing just beyond the edge of the light, its form tall and still, its face obscured by the darkness. I froze, the cold seeping into my skin as I stared at the figure. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It just stood there, watching. And then, slowly, it raised a hand. The motion was deliberate, almost mechanical, as it pressed its fingers against the glass. The tapping echoed through the room, each knock sharp and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock. And then, it was gone. The figure disappeared, the window empty once more, the only sound in the room, the faint hum of the Christmas lights. But the fear remained, coiled tightly in my chest, refusing to let go. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat by the fire, the bracelet lying on the coffee table in front of me, and watched as the shadows danced across the walls. The next morning, the snow outside was undisturbed, the world quiet and still. But the feeling lingered, a deep, gnawing unease that refused to fade. And as I stood there, staring out at the empty street, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still watching, waiting. The second package appeared 2 days later. I found it on the porch in the same spot as the first, half buried in the fresh snow. The wrapping was identical, the same bright paper, the same shiny red bow. But this time, the tag bore no name, just a blank piece of cardstock, its edges slightly curled from the damp air. I didn't want to open it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the cold biting at my hands as I stared at the box. The memory of the bracelet still weighed heavily on my mind, the image of my name, etched into its tarnished surface, replaying in my thoughts like a dark mantra. But the package was heavy in my hands, insistent, as though it demanded my attention. When I finally opened it, I was met with something far stranger than before. Nestled within the crumpled tissue paper was an old photograph. The edges were yellowed, the surface scratched and faded with age, but the image itself was clear, a child standing in front of a Christmas tree, their small frame wrapped in a heavy coat and scarf. The tree was decorated with an assortment of mismatched ornaments, the kind that looked homemade, and a single string of lights that barely illuminated the scene. But it was the child that caught my attention. Their face was blurred, as if smeared by an unseen hand. The rest of the image was sharp, the branches of the tree, the glint of the lights, even the texture of the coat, but the child's features were completely obscured. It wasn't natural. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. I turned the photo over, hoping for some kind of explanation, but the back was blank. No date, no name, nothing to indicate where it had come from. I set it down carefully, my hands trembling as I stared at it. The room felt colder now, the air heavy and oppressive, as though the walls were pressing in around me. That night, the tapping returned. It started softly, a faint rhythm that seemed to echo through the house. I tried to ignore it, burying myself in a book and turning the volume of the television up until the sound was drowned out. But it didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until it was impossible to ignore. I turned off the TV, the silence that followed so complete it made my ears ring. The tapping continued, coming from the front door this time. My heart pounded as I stood, the weight of the house pressing down on me as I moved toward the hallway. The shadows seemed darker now, the glow of the Christmas lights outside casting strange patterns across the walls. The door rattled slightly as I approached, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet. My hand hovered over the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shiver up my arm. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to lock the door and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But something stronger, a pull I couldn't explain, compelled me to turn the handle. The porch was empty. The snow was undisturbed, a pristine blanket of white stretching out across the yard. But the tapping continued, soft and rhythmic, even though there was no one there. My breath fogged the air as I stepped outside, the chill sinking into my skin as I scanned the darkness. The sound seemed to echo from all directions, bouncing off the trees and the houses like a disembodied heartbeat. And then I heard it, a faint giggle, high-pitched and breathy, coming from somewhere nearby. It was soft, almost playful, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. It didn't sound like a child's laugh. It sounded wrong, distorted, as though it had been stretched and warped into something unnatural. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands trembled as I turned the deadbolt, the sound of the metal clicking into place doing little to ease the pounding of my heart. The tapping stopped immediately, leaving the house in a suffocating silence. The photograph was still sitting on the table where I had left it, the child's blurred face staring back at me. But something was different now. The Christmas tree in the background had changed. It was darker, the lights extinguished, the ornaments cracked and broken. The child's hand, once resting at their side, was now raised, their blurred fingers pressed against the glass of the photograph, as though reaching for something, or someone, beyond the frame. I turned away, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps as I tried to steady myself. The air in the room felt colder now, the faint smell of pine and smoke seeping in from somewhere I couldn't identify. I grabbed the photo and shoved it back into the box, the paper crinkling as I stuffed it shut. But the image was burned into my mind, the blurred face and reaching hand etched into my thoughts like a scar. I didn't sleep that night. The giggle echoed in my ears, faint and distorted, long after it had stopped. The shadows in the room seemed to move when I wasn't looking, shifting in the corners of my vision like living things. I stayed by the fire, the flickering light my only comfort as the hours dragged on. By the time morning arrived, I was exhausted. The snow outside was heavier now, the yard blanketed in white, but there were no footprints, no sign of anyone or anything that could have been outside the night before. But the sense of unease lingered, clinging to me like a second skin as I went about my day. The box sat untouched on the table, its festive wrapping a mockery of the fear it had brought into my home. I thought about throwing it away, about burning it, burying it, anything to rid myself of its presence. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. The thought of destroying it filled me with a deep, irrational dread, as though doing so would somehow make everything worse. Instead, I left it there, unopened, and tried to convince myself that whatever was happening was just in my head. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the windows sent a jolt of fear through me. The house felt alive, its walls humming with a silent energy that made my skin crawl. And when night fell, I knew it wasn't over. The third box was waiting for me when I opened the door the next morning. It sat on the porch, half buried in snow like the others, its edges damp, but the paper somehow untouched. The wrapping was the same bright, cheerful design, and the red bow glistened in the weak morning light, a sharp contrast to the grim heaviness settling in my chest. I didn't want to touch it. My hands trembled as I stood there, staring down at the package like it might spring to life. The memory of the photograph was still fresh in my mind, the blurred face, the shifting details, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in this box would be worse. But even as my body screamed for me to leave it alone, my hands betrayed me, reaching down to pick it up. It was heavier than the last one, its weight unnatural, oppressive. I carried it inside, the chill from the box seeping into my skin even through my gloves, and set it on the table. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my breath fogging the air as I tried to summon the courage to open it. The silence in the house pressed against me, thick and suffocating, as though the walls were waiting too. Finally, with shaking hands, I tore through the paper. Inside was an old clock. Its surface was cracked, the wood splintered and warped with age, and the glass covering the face was shattered. The hands were frozen at 12-0, sharp and angular, as though they'd been deliberately forced into place. It gave off a faint, metallic smell, like rust and decay, and the longer I stared at it, the harder it became to breathe. There was something else in the box, tucked beneath the clock, a piece of paper, folded into a neat square. I hesitated before picking it up, the edges rough against my fingertips as I unfolded it. The words were written in the same elegant, looping script as the tag on the first package, but this time, the message was far more chilling. The time is near. The paper fell from my hands, drifting to the floor as the weight of the words settled over me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but there was no logic to cling to. I wanted to throw the box away, to take the clock and the note and bury them somewhere far from here. But a strange, paralyzing fear held me back. It felt like the house was watching, waiting to see what I would do. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to distract myself, to focus on anything but the box sitting on the table, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the frozen hands of the clock, the jagged cracks running across its surface like veins. The words from the note echoed in my mind, relentless and inescapable. When night fell, the house grew colder. The fire did little to chase away the chill, the shadows cast by the flickering flames stretching long and dark across the walls. I tried to convince myself it was just the winter air seeping in through the old windows, but deep down, I knew better. The cold wasn't natural. It was something else. Something wrong. At midnight, the sound began. It was faint at first, a low rhythmic ticking that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I sat up in bed, the sound pulling me from the edge of sleep, my breath catching in my throat as I strained to listen. The clock. Dash. It had to be the clock. But when I crept downstairs, the room was silent. The box was still on the table, untouched, the clock inside as lifeless as it had been that morning. And yet, the ticking persisted. It grew louder, echoing through the house like the beat of a massive, unseen heart. I stumbled back toward the stairs, the sound following me, growing sharper with each step. My pulse raced as I retreated to my room, slamming the door shut behind me, but the noise didn't stop. It burrowed into my mind, relentless and rhythmic, until it was all I could hear. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I sat there in the dark, my hands gripping the edge of the bed, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The house felt alive, the air humming with a silent energy that made my skin crawl. And then, from somewhere deep within the walls, I heard it. A single chime. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. The sound was followed by another, and another, each one louder than the last, until the house was filled with the eerie tolling of a clock that shouldn't have been working. 12 chimes. I stared at the door, my body frozen in place, as the final chime echoed through the silence. The air in the room felt heavier now, the shadows darker, deeper, as though something unseen was pressing against the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a painful reminder that I was still alive, still vulnerable. And then I saw it. The photograph. It was lying on the floor, just inside the doorway, the edges curling slightly as though it had been there for hours. I hadn't brought it upstairs. I was sure of that. My stomach turned as I crawled toward it, my hands trembling as I picked it up. The image had changed again. The child was no longer standing by the tree. They were sitting now, their back turned to the camera, their head tilted slightly, as though listening for something. The tree behind them was bare, its branches stripped of ornaments, its lights extinguished. The room in the photo was darker now, the shadows stretching across the floor like reaching hands. And in the far corner, barely visible against the blackness, was a shape, a figure. I dropped the photograph, the sound of it hitting the floor sharp and jarring in the quiet. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, as though the walls were closing in. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it again. The ticking. The ticking didn't stop. It was relentless, echoing through the house with a rhythm that burrowed into my mind. It felt alive, like a pulse, steady, deliberate, and inescapable. I stayed in bed, frozen under the covers, clutching the photograph in one hand and gripping the edge of the mattress with the other. The clock on the wall in my room had stopped years ago, the batteries long since dead, but now its hands moved, twitching forward with each tick. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Each movement felt like a countdown, though to what, I couldn't say. The hands crept toward midnight, their progress agonizingly slow, yet somehow too fast. My heart raced as the ticking grew louder, filling the room, pressing against my ears until I thought they might burst. When the clock struck 12, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, heavy and oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I sat there in the dark, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for the next sound, the next movement, the next sign that I wasn't alone. And then it came. A single knock. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. It came from somewhere downstairs, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the silence like a blade. Another knock followed, and another, each one louder than the last, until the sound echoed through the house like the tolling of a bell. I forced myself to move, swinging my legs over the side of the bed and standing on trembling legs. The photograph slipped from my fingers, landing face down on the floor, but I didn't pick it up. I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the doorway, the faint sliver of light from the hall casting a shadow across the floor. The knocks continued, steady and unrelenting, guiding me toward the stairs like a macabre rhythm. The house felt colder as I descended, the air thick with an unseen presence that made my skin crawl. Each step creaked beneath my weight, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the suffocating silence. When I reached the bottom, I turned toward the living room, my breath catching in my throat as I saw it. The fourth box. It sat in the center of the room, perfectly placed on the coffee table, its festive wrapping a cruel mockery of the fear gripping my chest. The red bow gleamed in the dim light, the tag fluttering slightly as though caught in a non-existent breeze. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't stop myself. My feet moved on their own, carrying me closer, the air around me growing colder with each step. The box was heavier than the others, the chill of it biting into my skin as I picked it up. My hands shook as I peeled back the paper, the sound of tearing, wrapping unnaturally loud in the quiet. The lid came off easily, revealing a layer of black tissue paper. I hesitated before pulling it back, my breath fogging the air as I stared down at the contents. Bones. They were small, fragile-looking, their edges smooth and worn as though they had been handled countless times. They were arranged carefully, almost reverently, in the shape of a star. At the center lay a piece of parchment, its surface yellowed with age. The same looping script from before, scrawled across it in uneven lines. A gift must be given in return. I dropped the box, the sound of it hitting the table reverberating through the room. The bones spilled out, scattering across the floor in a grotesque pattern, their stark whiteness glaring against the dark wood. My hands trembled as I backed away, my chest heaving as the weight of the message sank in. The house groaned around me, the sound low and guttural, like a living thing shifting in its sleep. The fire in the hearth flickered violently, the shadows on the walls twisting and writhing like they were alive. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, a low murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It grew louder, rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence, the words indistinct but filled with an undeniable malice. The shadows on the walls stretched longer, darker, their movements growing more erratic as the voice filled the room. I stumbled back toward the stairs, my foot catching on the edge of the rug as I fell to the floor. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs, but I barely noticed. My eyes were fixed on the living room, where the shadows had begun to coalesce, pooling together into a single, massive shape. It loomed over the room, its edges shifting and undulating like smoke, and as I watched, it began to take form. The figure was impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't have a face, just a blank expanse of darkness that seemed to drink in the light. And yet, I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. The voice grew louder, the words now clear and sharp. The gift must be given. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its shadow stretching across the floor until it touched my trembling hand. The air around me grew colder, the weight of its presence pressing down on me until I couldn't breathe. And then, just as it reached for me, it stopped. The fire went out, plunging the house into darkness. I sat there in the cold, the sound of my ragged breathing, the only thing breaking the silence. The figure was gone, the shadows receding into the corners of the room, but the weight of its presence lingered. The words echoed in my mind, relentless and inescapable. The gift must be given. The house felt different after the fire went out. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was alive, thick and suffocating, pressing against my skin like a tangible weight. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old walls, felt purposeful, as though the house itself was shifting, closing in around me. The air was heavy, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of something long decayed. I stayed on the floor, frozen in place, my breaths shallow and ragged. The shadows in the corners no longer felt like tricks of the mind. They were deeper, darker, moving with a silent intent that made my skin crawl. The box, its contents spilled across the floor, seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural energy, the bones gleaming faintly in the dim light. And then, the clock began to chime. It was slow at first, each toll ringing out with an unbearable clarity that seemed to reverberate through my chest. I turned toward the sound, my eyes drawn to the clock I hadn't dared touch since the box arrived. Its hands moved now, jerking forward with each chime, though the shattered glass covering its face hadn't been repaired. Midnight again, though time felt meaningless now. With the final chime, the house fell silent. Not the kind of silence that brought relief, but a stillness so profound it made my ears ring. The air was heavy with expectation, every breath sharp and shallow as I waited for whatever would come next. I wanted to move, to run, to hide, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey, held captive by the unseen force that now ruled my home. And then I heard it, footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, each step punctuated by the faint creak of the wooden floor. They didn't come from the hallway or the stairs, but from everywhere at once. A sound that reverberated through the house, surrounding me, closing in. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared into the darkness, every nerve screaming at me to move, but I couldn't. The voice returned, louder now, resonating through the walls like a physical force. The words were clear, sharp, each one hitting me like a blow. The gift must be given. The time has come. The shadows on the walls shifted, pulling away from the corners, to form long, jagged shapes that stretched toward the center of the room. They twisted and writhed like living things, their movements erratic and violent, until they converged into a single, massive form. The figure that had haunted me since the first package stood before me now, towering and impossibly dark, its featureless face tilted downward as though gazing at me. Its hand extended, long and skeletal, the fingers curling in a beckoning motion. The message was clear. It wasn't going to take anything from me. It wanted me to offer it willingly. My chest tightened as I struggled to breathe, my mind racing with every terrible possibility. The words from the note echoed in my thoughts, relentless and inescapable. A gift must be given in return. I looked down at the bones scattered across the floor, their pale surfaces gleaming faintly in the dim light. They weren't just bones. They were pieces of something, someone left behind as an offering. The weight of understanding settled over me like a shroud, my stomach twisting as the realization hit me. This wasn't just about receiving. It was about becoming. The figure took a step closer, its shadow stretching across the room until it touched my feet. The air grew colder, the weight of its presence pressing against my chest like a vice. I could feel it now, not just in the room, but inside me, threading through my thoughts, my memories, every part of me. It wasn't just watching, it was consuming. And then I saw it. The photograph lay face down on the floor where I had dropped it earlier, but the image had changed again. The child was gone now, the Christmas tree replaced by an empty, featureless room. But in the center of the photograph stood a new figure. Me. My face was blurred, my hand raised as though reaching for something, or someone, beyond the frame. The shadows on the walls shifted violently, pulling toward the center of the room like a black tide. The figure loomed over me, its outstretched hand now inches from my face, the cold radiating from it sharp and unbearable. I closed my eyes, my body trembling as the voice filled the room one final time. The gift is given. The world went black. When I woke, I wasn't in the house anymore. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and smoke, the ground beneath me cold and damp. Snow fell softly around me, the flakes landing on my skin and disappearing almost immediately. The clearing was empty, the trees silent, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. I turned slowly, my breath fogging the air as my eyes adjusted to the dim light. In the center of the clearing stood a tree, its branches bare, its trunk twisted and blackened. Beneath it lay a single box, its wrapping pristine, despite the snow. I approached it slowly, my hands trembling as I reached for the tag tied to the bow. The words were written in that same elegant script, but this time they were different. From you. I stumbled back, the weight of the realization crashing down on me like a tidal wave. The clearing seemed to shift around me, the trees bending and twisting as though alive. The sense of being watched grew stronger, the shadows at the edge of the clearing deepening, pressing closer. And then I saw them. The figures emerged from the trees, their forms shrouded in darkness, their movements slow and deliberate. They formed a circle around the tree, their heads tilted downward as though in reverence. Their presence was overwhelming, the air around me growing colder with each step they took. One of them raised a hand, pointing toward the box. The message was clear. I was no longer the recipient. I was the giver now, the weight of the role settling over me like a chain I could never break. The last thing I saw before the shadows swallowed me was the box, its red bow gleaming faintly in the snow, waiting for its next recipient. It started the morning after the first snowfall of the season. I remember staring out the kitchen window, watching the world transform into a winter wonderland. The yard was pristine, untouched by footprints or the usual signs of life. The snow glittered under the pale gray sky, casting an almost ethereal glow over the neighborhood. It should have been beautiful, peaceful, but there was something about the silence that unsettled me. That's when I saw it. A snowman stood in the middle of my yard. It hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of it. The 3 unevenly stacked spheres of snow were topped with a crooked stick for a nose, and 2 dark, empty hollows where its eyes should have been. There were no footprints leading to or from it, no signs of anyone having been there to build it. It simply existed. At first, I thought it was some sort of prank. Maybe one of the neighborhood kids had snuck into my yard during the night, but the idea didn't sit right with me. The snow was undisturbed, not a single mark or scuff breaking its smooth surface. And the snowman itself, there was something off about it. Something I couldn't quite put into words. The longer I looked at it, the more I felt a cold dread creeping into my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I passed the window, I felt its hollow gaze fixed on me, unblinking and unrelenting. I closed the curtains to block it out, but the image of it standing there lingered in my mind like a dark shadow. That night, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows and shaking the branches of the old oak tree in the yard. I tried to ignore it, burying myself in a book and turning the television up to drown out the sound. But as the hours ticked by, the unease grew stronger, settling deep in my chest like a heavy weight. The house felt colder than usual, the air carrying a faint metallic tang that I couldn't explain. It was around midnight when I heard it. A faint tapping, so soft I almost missed it over the hum of the heater. At first, I thought it was just the wind knocking a loose branch against the side of the house, but the sound was too deliberate. Tap, but I. Tap, ta-da. Tap. 3 evenly spaced knocks, like a knuckle rapping against glass. My heart pounded as I turned toward the sound, my eyes darting to the window across the room. The curtains were drawn, the thick fabric hiding whatever lay beyond, but the tapping continued, each knock louder than the last. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, just a branch, but my body didn't believe me. My hands trembled as I stood, the floorboards creaking under my weight as I moved toward the window. I hesitated before pulling the curtain aside, my breath fogging the glass as I peered out into the dark. The yard was still, the snow glinting faintly under the moonlight. But the snowman had moved. It wasn't in the middle of the yard anymore. It was closer to the house now, its crooked nose pointing directly at the window where I stood. My stomach twisted as I stared at it, the empty hollows of its eyes seeming to bore into me. The stick it had for an arm was raised now, pressed against the glass, as though it had been the one knocking. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. There had to be one. There had to be. But the snow around the snowman was untouched. No footprints, no signs of movement. It was impossible, but there it was, staring at me through the window with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the living room, every light in the house turned on, the fire in the hearth crackling weakly as I tried to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. But every time I glanced at the window, I could feel it watching me. Its hollow gaze burned into my thoughts, relentless and unyielding. By the time morning arrived, the snow had stopped, leaving the yard blanketed in a thick, pristine layer of white. I hesitated before pulling back the curtains, my hands shaking as I peered outside. The snowman was still there, but it had moved again. This time, it was standing just outside the front door, its crooked nose brushing against the glass, its arm raised as though reaching for the handle. I didn't leave the house that day. The thought of stepping outside, of getting close to that thing, filled me with a deep, bone-chilling dread. I tried to distract myself with chores, with television, with anything that could take my mind off the snowman. But no matter what I did, I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing against the walls of the house like a living thing. That night, the tapping returned. It was louder this time, more insistent, echoing through the house like a drumbeat. I stayed in bed, my body frozen, my breath hitching with every knock. I didn't dare look out the window, didn't dare acknowledge its presence. But the sound grew louder, more urgent, until it felt like the walls themselves were trembling under the force of it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, heavy and oppressive, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I lay there in the dark, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for the next sound, the next movement, the next sign that I wasn't alone. But nothing came. The house was silent, the air still, the shadows on the walls long and unmoving. When morning came, I found it standing in the hallway. The snowman shouldn't have been there. It couldn't have been there. But there it was, its crooked form glistening faintly in the dim light. Its hollow eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. The floor around it was wet, the snow melting slowly, pooling into a dark, slushy mess that reeked of something foul. And in its hand, clutched tightly in its crooked stick fingers, was a piece of paper. The edges were damp, the ink smudged, but I could still make out the words scrawled across it in jagged, uneven letters. Let me in. I didn't touch the note. I couldn't. The sight of those 3 words, jagged and uneven, was enough to root me to the spot, my breath caught in my throat. The snowman stood motionless, its hollow eyes boring into me, the damp paper clutched tightly in its stick fingers. Puddle beneath it was spreading, dark and slushy, the faint stench of decay curling into the air like a silent warning. The sun was rising outside, casting weak streaks of light across the hallway, but the warmth it should have brought was absent. The air in the house felt colder than ever, heavy and stifling, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. I backed away slowly, my footsteps barely making a sound against the wooden floor, my eyes never leaving the snowman. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough to paralyze me. I locked myself in the bedroom. The door closed tightly behind me, though I knew it wouldn't stop anything if it really wanted to get in. My mind raced, replaying the events of the past 2 days like a broken record. The snowman in the yard. The tapping on the window. The note. None of it made sense, but the one thing I knew for certain was that it wasn't going to stop. Hours passed in a haze. I sat by the window, staring out at the snow-covered yard, my body tense with anticipation. I half expected to see another snowman appear, or for the one inside to suddenly re-emerge, but the yard remained empty. The stillness of it was almost worse than the fear. It was as though the world outside had been frozen in time, holding its breath in eerie anticipation. By nightfall, I couldn't stand the silence anymore. The tension had coiled tightly in my chest, every creak of the house sending a jolt of fear through me. I knew I should call someone, anyone, but what would I even say? That a snowman had appeared in my house, clutching a note that told me to let it in? They would think I was insane. Maybe I was. But deep down, I knew this wasn't something anyone else could stop. The tapping started again just after midnight. This time, it came from the bedroom window. It was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic knock that could have been mistaken for the wind. But it grew louder, more insistent, each knock sharper and more deliberate than the last. My heart pounded as I turned toward the window, the curtain fluttering slightly as though something, or someone, was just on the other side. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to stay where I was, to hide, to pretend it wasn't happening. But the tapping didn't stop. It echoed through the room, filling the air with its relentless rhythm, until I couldn't take it anymore. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain, my breath catching in my throat as I pulled it aside. The snowman was there, standing just outside the window. Its face was pressed against the glass, the hollow sockets where its eyes should have been staring directly into mine. The stick that formed its arm was raised, tapping against the glass with a slow, deliberate motion. Frost had spread across the window pane, the intricate patterns twisting and curling like frozen veins, and in the center of it all, scrawled in the ice, were two words: "Look back." My blood ran cold. My body stiffened, every nerve on edge as the words burned into my mind. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. But something compelled me, a force stronger than my fear, pulling me toward the shadows behind me. Slowly, I turned, my heart hammering in my chest as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. The snowman was in the room. It stood in the corner, its crooked form silhouetted against the faint glow of the streetlights outside. The puddle beneath it had grown, spreading across the floor in dark, slushy streaks that reeked of rot. Its hollow eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, unrelenting, and in its stick, fingers, was another note. This one was damp and crumpled, the ink smeared but still legible. "Why won't you listen?" My legs gave out beneath me, and I sank to the floor, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The air was freezing now, my breath fogging in the faint light, as the shadows in the room seemed to close in around me. The snowman didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, the weight of its gaze pressing against me like a physical force. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at it, waiting for it to do something, anything, but it remained still, its hollow eyes watching me with a patience that felt infinite. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have blacked out, because when I opened my eyes, the snowman was gone. The only sign it had been there was the puddle on the floor, now partially frozen, and the note, crumpled and damp, lying in the center of it. I didn't touch it. I couldn't bring myself to. The words were burned into my mind, their meaning as clear as the icy air in the room. Something was coming, and it wouldn't stop until I let it in. The puddle on the floor hadn't fully melted when I woke up. The dampness clung to the wood in uneven streaks, the faint, sickly smell of rot lingering in the air. I stared at it from across the room, my heart still pounding in my chest, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But the memory of the snowman standing in the corner, its hollow eyes fixed on me, wouldn't fade. It had been here. I didn't know how, but it had. The note was still lying in the center of the puddle. I hadn't touched it. I couldn't. The words, "Why won't you listen?" were etched into my mind, their sharp edges cutting through my thoughts like glass. Whatever this thing was, it was trying to tell me something. But I didn't want to know. I didn't want to understand. I just wanted it to stop. Outside, the snow was falling again, thick flakes drifting silently to the ground. The world looked peaceful, untouched, but I knew better now. The quiet wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Every shadow felt alive, every creak of the house like a warning. The air inside was heavy, colder than it should have been, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I spent the day trying to keep myself busy. I cleaned the kitchen, vacuumed the living room, even attempted to sort through the stack of unopened mail on the counter. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against me, following me from room to room, never letting up. It wasn't just in my head. I could feel it. By nightfall, the house had grown unbearably cold. The fire in the hearth refused to catch, the logs hissing and sputtering no matter how much kindling I added. The electricity flickered once, then twice, before plunging the house into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, the weak glow of the screen barely enough to light the room. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the faint sound of the wind outside. And then the tapping began. It started at the window in the living room, soft and rhythmic, barely audible over the howling wind. My breath hitched as I turned toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to look. I knew what I would see. But the sound was relentless, each knock pulling me closer, dragging me to the edge of the room like a puppet on a string. I pulled the curtain aside, and there it was. The snowman was standing just outside the window, its crooked form framed by the pale glow of the moon. Its hollow eyes stared back at me, unblinking, unrelenting. And in its stick hand was another note. It pressed the paper against the glass, the edges curling slightly in the wind, the words written in the same jagged, uneven scrawl. "It's your turn." My stomach turned as the meaning of the words sank in. My turn for what? I backed away from the window, my hands trembling, my mind racing. The snowman didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the room with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch toward it, twisting and writhing like living things, drawn to its hollow gaze. The tapping grew louder, sharper, like nails scraping against the glass. I stumbled back further, my foot catching on the edge of the rug as I fell to the floor. My phone slipped from my hand, skittering across the wood, its faint glow casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, the room was silent. And then, I heard the door creak open. It was slow, deliberate, the sound of the hinges groaning echoing through the quiet. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the hallway, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. The front door was wide open, snow blowing in across the threshold in icy tendrils. The faint outline of the snowman stood in the doorway, its hollow eyes fixed on me, its stick fingers outstretched. I scrambled to my feet, my back pressed against the far wall, my mind screaming at me to run. But my legs wouldn't move. The snowman stepped forward, its crooked form moving with an unnatural grace, the sound of its feet crunching against the wood, sending chills down my spine. The puddle on the floor from the night before had frozen now, its surface cracked and glistening, and the snowman's feet left jagged trails of ice in their wake. It stopped just a few feet from me, the sharp, sour smell of decay growing stronger with each breath. Its stick hand reached out, the note clutched tightly in its fingers, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. The shadows froze, the wind outside died, and all I could hear was the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then it dropped the note. The paper fluttered to the floor, landing face up in the frozen puddle. The words were clearer now, etched deep into the damp surface, their meaning undeniable. "Build it." The snowman didn't move after that. It just stood there, watching me, its presence as heavy and suffocating as the air in the room. My hands trembled as I reached for the note, the paper damp and cold against my skin. The meaning of the words settled over me like a lead weight, my stomach twisting in fear and confusion. Build what? Another snowman? Why? My mind raced with questions, but the snowman offered no answers. It simply waited. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was empty, the front door closed, the only sign it had been there, the faint trails of ice on the floor, and the note still clutched in my trembling hands. The air was freezing, my breath fogging in the dim light, but I didn't dare move. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't done with me yet. And deep down, I knew that if I didn't do what it wanted, it wouldn't just watch anymore. I spent the next few hours pacing the house, the note crumpled in my hand. The words, "build it," burned in my mind. Their meaning unclear, but their weight undeniable. What was it asking me to do? Another snowman? Something else entirely? The fear clawed at my chest, an icy grip that tightened with every passing minute. I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The house felt darker now, even though it was still daylight outside. The shadows stretched longer, deeper, twisting in unnatural ways that made the walls seem alive. The air was heavy, oppressive, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes felt deliberate, purposeful, as though the house itself was conspiring against me. By the time the sun set, I was barely holding it together. The cold inside the house had become unbearable, seeping into my bones no matter how many layers I wore. The fire refused to stay lit, the flames sputtering and dying no matter how much wood I added. It was as if the house was rejecting warmth, embracing the encroaching chill with open arms. And then, just as the last light faded from the sky, the snowman returned. It was standing in the yard this time, closer to the house than it had ever been. Its hollow eyes were fixed on me through the window, unblinking, unrelenting. The stick that served as its arm was raised again, pointing toward the side of the house where the shed stood. A faint glow emanated from its body, an eerie pale light that made the snow around it shimmer like glass. I didn't want to go outside. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay inside, to lock the doors and pretend it wasn't there. But I knew that wasn't an option. Ignoring it hadn't worked before, and deep down, I knew it wouldn't leave until I did what it wanted. I bundled up as best I could, my hands trembling as I pulled on my coat and boots. The cold hit me like a wall the moment I stepped outside, sharp and biting, cutting through my clothes as if they weren't there. The snow crunched under my feet as I made my way to the shed, each step heavier than the last, my breath fogging the air in front of me. The door to the shed creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness like a scream. The interior was dark, the faint glow from the snowman barely reaching inside. I fumbled for the light switch, but it was useless. The bulb flickered weakly once, then died, plunging the shed into an oppressive darkness. I turned back toward the snowman, its hollow eyes still fixed on me, its stick arm now pointing to a pile of tools in the corner. A shovel, an old saw, and a set of gardening shears lay scattered on the floor, their metal edges glinting faintly in the dim light. The meaning was clear. It wanted me to build something. But what? My hands trembled as I picked up the shovel, the cold metal burning against my skin. The snowman didn't move, but its presence loomed larger, its shadow stretching across the snow like a dark tide. I turned back toward the yard, the weight of the shovel heavy in my hands, and began to dig. The snow was thick, packed tightly from days of accumulation, but the ground beneath was soft, almost unnaturally so. The deeper I dug, the more the earth seemed to yield, as though it wanted me to keep going. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, each motion sapping my strength, but I couldn't stop. The weight of its gaze pressed against me, a silent command that drove me forward. After what felt like hours, the shovel struck something hard. The sound echoed through the stillness, sharp and jarring, sending a shiver down my spine. I dropped to my knees, brushing away the dirt and snow with trembling hands, my heart pounding as the object beneath came into view. It was a box, old and weathered, its wooden surface cracked and splintered with age. Rusted metal hinges held it together, the faint smell of decay wafting from the edges. My stomach turned as I pried it open, the lid creaking loudly in the silence. Inside was a pile of bones. They were small, delicate, their surfaces smooth and worn, as though they had been handled many times. A skull lay nestled among them, its empty sockets staring back at me with an unsettling intensity. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the cold seeping into my skin as I lifted it from the box. And then, from behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching softly through the snow. My breath hitched as I turned, the skull still clutched in my hands. The snowman was standing just a few feet away now, its hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light. It raised its stick arm, pointing toward the house, and for the first time, I understood what it wanted. I stumbled back, the skull slipping from my grasp and landing in the snow with a dull thud. The snowman didn't move, but the weight of its gaze bore into me, a silent command that left no room for argument. My legs moved on their own, carrying me back toward the house, the air around me growing colder with each step. When I reached the front door, it was already open. The house was dark, the air inside thick and suffocating. Shadows writhed along the walls, twisting and contorting in ways that defied logic. The cold was unbearable now, my breath fogging in the dim light as I stepped inside. The snowman followed, its presence filling the room with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. In the center of the living room, a single candle flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The note from before lay on the floor beside it, the words "Build It" scrawled across the damp surface in jagged, uneven letters. The shadows stretched toward the note, their movement slow and deliberate, as though they were reaching for something. And then, in the faint glow of the candlelight, I saw them. More snowmen, their crooked forms pressed against the windows, their hollow eyes staring into the house. They didn't move, but their presence was overwhelming, their gaze heavy and unrelenting. The snowman in the room stepped closer, its shadow stretching across the floor as it raised its stick arm one final time. The meaning was clear. It wasn't asking anymore. The snowmen at the windows didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. Their hollow eyes seemed to pierce through the glass, through the walls, through me. The room felt smaller, the air heavy and thick with a cold that burrowed into my chest. The snowman inside stood motionless, but its command was clear. The words "Build It" repeated in my mind, an unrelenting mantra that drowned out every rational thought. I didn't know what it wanted, not completely, but I knew it wouldn't stop until I obeyed. My hands trembled as I picked up the shovel again, its weight a grim reminder of the task ahead. The snowman stepped aside, its shadow dragging along the floor like a living thing, giving me just enough space to pass. The snowmen at the windows didn't react as I stepped outside, though I could feel their gaze following me as I trudged into the yard. The night was unnaturally still, the wind gone, the air heavy with an eerie quiet. The glow of the snowman's hollow eyes illuminated the yard, casting long, shifting shadows across the snow. My breath fogged the air as I began to dig, the shovel biting into the frozen ground with a dull, metallic scrape. The earth resisted at first, hard and unyielding, but with each strike of the shovel, it softened, almost as if something beneath was helping me. The hole grew deeper, the snow around me piling higher, the effort sapping every ounce of strength from my body. My hands ached, my fingers numb, but I couldn't stop. The snowman's presence loomed behind me, an unspoken command urging me onward. Then the shovel hit something solid. The sound reverberated through the stillness, sharp and jarring, making my heart leap into my throat. I dropped to my knees, brushing away the snow and dirt with trembling hands. My stomach turned as the object beneath came into view. It was another box. This one was larger than the last, its wood splintered and blackened, the hinges rusted and barely holding together. The air around it felt colder, sharper, as though it was radiating its own chill. My breath hitched as I pried the lid open, the wood groaning under the pressure. Inside, the contents were worse than I could have imagined. Bones, but not just fragments like before, but a complete skeleton, its structure twisted and wrong. The skull was elongated, the sockets deep and empty, the jaw frozen in a silent scream. Scattered among the bones were objects, pieces of cloth, broken ornaments, a cracked photograph frame. Each item felt personal, like relics of a life that had been erased. At the bottom of the box was a single note, folded neatly, the paper yellowed and brittle. My hands shook as I picked it up, the words scrawled in the same jagged handwriting that had haunted me for days. One more piece. I stumbled back, the note slipping from my fingers as the full weight of its meaning settled over me. One more piece. It wanted me to complete it, to make it whole. My stomach churned, the bile rising in my throat as I stared down at the box, the twisted skeleton seeming to shift under my gaze. The snowmen at the windows were closer now, their hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light. Their presence was suffocating, pressing against me from all sides, their intent clear. I was the final piece. The realization hit me like a blow, the air leaving my lungs in a sharp gasp. This was never about building anything. It was about becoming. I tried to run, but the snow beneath my feet gave way, pulling me down like quicksand. The shadows stretched toward me, dark tendrils twisting and curling around my legs, dragging me back toward the box. My screams were swallowed by the night, the cold biting into my skin as the snowman stepped forward, its hollow gaze fixed on me. It reached out, its stick fingers brushing against my chest, and the cold that followed was unbearable. It wasn't just physical, it was inside me, clawing at my thoughts, pulling me apart piece by piece. The shadows wrapped around me tighter, the snow rising to meet me, and then everything went dark. When I woke, I wasn't in the yard anymore. The world around me was white, an endless expanse of snow stretching in every direction. The air was still, the silence oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of wind in the distance. I tried to move, but my body was heavy, my limbs stiff and unresponsive. The cold was gone, replaced by an emptiness that spread through me like a hollow ache. And then I saw them. The snowmen were everywhere, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, their forms scattered across the horizon like sentinels. Each one was unique, different shapes, different sizes, but all sharing the same twisted, unnatural presence. And among them, I saw myself. I was one of them now. My body was frozen, my form crooked and wrong, my eyes empty hollows staring out into the endless white. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't think beyond the single, unrelenting truth. I had been taken. The snowman's whisper had become my reality, and there was no escaping it. Far in the distance, a new figure appeared, a lone figure, trudging through the snow toward the yard I had once called home. Another life, another victim, another piece. It was late December, just a few days before Christmas, when the first bell rang. I remember the exact moment vividly, sitting in the dim light of my living room, watching the snow fall outside. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors beneath me. The glow of the Christmas tree lights flickered softly, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. Outside, the snow blanketed the world in a thick, heavy silence that felt unnatural, almost suffocating. That's when I heard it. The sound was faint at first, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind. A soft chime, distant but deliberate, its tone sharp and clear against the muffled quiet of the night. My first thought was that it might be a neighbor's decoration, one of those automated holiday displays that played carols on a loop. But as I listened, the sound didn't repeat. It lingered, echoing faintly, before fading into silence. I tried to shrug it off, convincing myself it was nothing. Just the wind, maybe, or a stray sound carried from farther down the road. But the unease lingered. Something about the chime felt wrong. It wasn't cheerful or festive. It was cold, hollow, and it sent a shiver down my spine that no amount of hot cocoa or blankets could chase away. The next hour passed uneventfully, though the sound of that single bell stayed with me, replaying in my mind like a broken record. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was the holidays, after all. Bells were everywhere, on TV commercials, in the mall, even jingling from the collars of the neighbor's dog. But when the clock struck 11, the chime rang out again. This time, it was louder, clearer. I froze, the mug of cocoa slipping from my hands and landing with a dull thud on the carpet. The sound wasn't coming from the road or a neighbor's yard. It was coming from the woods, the dense cluster of trees that bordered my backyard, their skeletal branches twisting upward like bony fingers clawing at the night sky. The chime echoed again, its tone sharper now, cutting through the stillness with a precision that made my chest tighten. My eyes darted to the window, searching for movement among the shadows of the trees. But the yard was still, the snow untouched. Yet the sound persisted, faint but deliberate, as if something deep in the woods was calling out. I tried to push the thought aside, turning my attention back to the TV, but the sense of unease only grew. The shadows on the walls seemed darker now, shifting in ways that didn't match the flicker of the Christmas lights. The air felt colder, heavier, and every creak of the house made me jump. At midnight, the bell rang again. This time, it was closer. The sound was sharp, piercing, reverberating through the house like a warning. My stomach twisted as I turned toward the window, the faint glow of the moon illuminating the yard. That's when I saw it, a faint light flickering in the distance, deep within the woods. It was small, almost like the flame of a candle, bobbing and swaying as though held by an unseen hand. I leaned closer, pressing my face against the cold glass, my breath fogging the window as I strained to see. The light moved slowly, deliberately, weaving between the trees in a pattern that felt purposeful. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy and oppressive, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I sat there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for the light to return, for the bell to ring again. But the woods remained dark, the snow-covered trees standing silent and still. When morning came, I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream, a trick of the light, a stray sound carried by the wind. But when I stepped outside to clear the snow from the porch, I found something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. They were faint, half buried in the fresh snow, but unmistakable. A trail of small, evenly spaced footprints leading from the edge of the woods to my back porch. The snow around them was undisturbed, as though whatever had made them had materialized out of thin air. My stomach churned as I followed the trail, my boots crunching softly against the snow. The prints stopped just short of the porch, directly in front of the sliding glass door. There were no marks leading away, no sign of retreat. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had stood there had simply disappeared. My eyes darted to the woods, the skeletal branches swaying gently in the wind, but there was no sign of movement, no sound. Just a heavy, suffocating silence. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me and drawing the curtains tight. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Had someone been watching me? Why and how had they vanished so completely, leaving no trace behind? The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to distract myself with holiday preparations, wrapping gifts, hanging garlands, baking cookies, but the sense of unease lingered, coiling tightly in my chest. Every so often, I found myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see the light in the woods or the trail of footprints returning. By the time night fell, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed from a day spent jumping at every shadow, every sound. I collapsed onto the couch, pulling a blanket tightly around me, and turned the TV to a mindless holiday movie in a desperate attempt to drown out my thoughts. But at 11 o'clock, the bell rang again. This time, it was right outside. The sound was sharper this time, louder, as if it had moved right to my doorstep. The bell's haunting chime lingered in the air, each note sinking into my chest like a shard of ice. I gripped the blanket tighter around me, my breath catching in my throat. Something wasn't right. I could feel it, the weight of an unseen presence pressing against the house, heavy and suffocating. I forced myself to move, each step toward the window feeling heavier than the last. The curtains were drawn tight, but the faint glow of moonlight filtered through the fabric, casting ghostly patterns across the floor. My hands trembled as I reached for the edge of the curtain, pulling it back just enough to peek outside. The yard was still. The snow sparkled faintly under the moonlight, untouched and pristine. There, at the edge of the woods, stood a figure. It was cloaked in shadow, its form indistinct against the darkness of the trees. The only thing I could make out was the faint glint of metal in its hand, the bell. My stomach turned as I watched it, the figure swaying gently from side to side, as though caught in some invisible current. The bell rang again, the sound piercing and deliberate, and the figure raised its arm, pointing toward the house. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Who or what was that? And why were they here? The thought of stepping outside, of confronting whatever was standing at the edge of the woods, filled me with a deep, bone-chilling dread. I paced the room, my hands trembling, my thoughts spiraling. I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? That there was a figure standing at the edge of the woods, ringing a bell. It sounded ridiculous, even to me. And yet, the fear gripping my chest was all too real. The bell rang again. This time, it was closer. I froze, my breath hitching as the sound echoed through the house. It wasn't coming from the woods anymore. It was coming from the porch. My stomach dropped as I turned toward the front door, the shadows on the walls twisting and stretching as though drawn toward the sound. I crept toward the door, each step sending a jolt of fear through me. The bell rang again, its tone sharper now, more insistent. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob, my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn back, to hide. But I couldn't. Something stronger than fear compelled me forward, pulling me toward the sound. When I opened the door, the porch was empty. The cold night air rushed in, biting at my skin and sending a shiver down my spine. The snow on the porch was undisturbed, no footprints, no sign of anyone or anything that could have been there. And yet, the sound of the bell lingered, faint and distant, like an echo carried on the wind. I stepped outside, the icy chill seeping through my socks as I peered into the darkness. The yard was still, the woods silent, their skeletal branches swaying gently in the wind. But as I turned to close the door, something caught my eye. A single set of footprints led from the edge of the woods to the porch. They were deep, crisp, each step perfectly aligned, as though whoever had made them had been marching with purpose. My stomach churned as I followed the trail with my eyes, the prints stopping abruptly just before the door, as if their maker had simply vanished. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut and locking it tightly behind me. My heart pounded as I pressed my back against the wood, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The air inside the house felt heavier now, the cold creeping in through the walls, through the floor, through my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. I sat on the couch, my knees pulled to my chest, the blanket wrapped tightly around me. The bell didn't ring again, but the silence that followed was almost worse. It pressed against me, thick and suffocating, amplifying every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind. By the time the first rays of dawn broke through the curtains, I was exhausted, my body heavy with fatigue, but my mind too alert to rest. I forced myself to move, to go through the motions of the day, but every sound, every shadow, set my nerves on edge. The footprints on the porch were gone, buried beneath the fresh snow, but their memory lingered, an unshakable reminder of the night before. As the sun dipped below the horizon once more, the sense of unease returned, coiling tightly in my chest like a living thing. I tried to ignore it, burying myself in holiday preparations, but the weight of it was inescapable. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the Christmas lights sent a jolt of fear through me. At exactly 11 o'clock, the bell rang again. This time, it came from the backyard. The sound was sharp, piercing, cutting through the stillness like a blade. My stomach dropped as I turned toward the back door, the shadows in the room, twisting and stretching, as though drawn toward the sound. My hands trembled as I approached the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The figure was there again, standing at the edge of the woods. It was closer this time, its form more distinct against the snow. The bell in its hand glinted faintly in the moonlight, its hollow eyes fixed on me. My chest tightened as it raised its arm, pointing toward the back door. And then it rang the bell again. The bell's chime lingered long after it had stopped ringing. It wasn't just the sound itself, it was the weight of it, pressing against my chest, seeping into my bones. The figure at the edge of the woods hadn't moved. It stood perfectly still, its outline stark against the pale glow of the snow. The bell in its hand hung at its side now, the faint glint of metal catching the moonlight like a blade. My breath fogged the glass as I stared, frozen in place. The longer I looked, the more I felt something shift in the air around me. It wasn't just cold. It was wrong, like the kind of chill that didn't come from winter, but from something far deeper, far darker. The figure raised its arm again, pointing directly at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw it smile. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding, my hands trembling, as I fumbled to draw the curtain shut. The fabric blocked the sight of the figure, but it didn't do anything to ease the crushing sense of dread that filled the room. The air felt heavier now, the silence more suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in around me. The bell rang again. This time, it came from the front of the house. My blood ran cold. There was no time for it to have moved, no time for anything to cross the yard, yet the sound was unmistakable. It was closer now, louder, the chime sharp and deliberate. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. I forced myself to move, my feet dragging as I crept toward the front door. The porch light cast a faint glow across the snow, illuminating the yard in uneven patches. I pressed my face against the window, peering out through a narrow gap in the curtain. The figure was there, standing just beyond the porch steps. The bell in its hand swayed gently, the sound muted but still chillingly clear. It didn't move, didn't speak, but the message was clear. It was waiting for me. I backed away from the window, my pulse thundering in my ears. The air in the house felt colder now, the shadows stretching longer, twisting into shapes that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. My breathing was shallow, each inhale sharp and painful, as though the very air was fighting me. The bell rang again, louder this time, its tone carrying an undeniable urgency. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything other than stand there frozen in fear. But my body refused to listen. My legs felt like lead, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold on to the edge of the table for support. The figure outside didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, its gaze burning through the walls like a physical force. And then, the knocking started. It was soft at first, barely more than a whisper against the door. A faint, rhythmic tap, 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 like someone gently rapping their knuckles against the wood. But it grew louder, more insistent, the sound echoing through the house like a drum beat. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned toward the door, the shadows on the walls twisting and writhing in the dim light. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening, heavy and oppressive, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, the sound of boots crunching softly against the wooden floor. My stomach twisted as I turned toward the hallway, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. The sound was coming closer, each step measured and deliberate, echoing in the silence like the ticking of a clock. I stumbled backward, my hands fumbling for anything to hold on to, as I moved toward the living room. The fire in the hearth had gone out, leaving the room bathed in shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with every flicker of the Christmas lights. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the doorway. My breath hitched as a shadow appeared in the hallway, tall and still, its outline faint but unmistakable. The bell rang again, the sound sharp and piercing, and the shadow stepped forward. My heart pounded as I scrambled back, my hands clutching at the couch for support as the figure entered the room. It was the same figure I'd seen outside, its form cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. The bell in its hand swayed gently, the sound echoing through the room with an eerie clarity. It didn't speak, didn't move further, but its presence filled the space, heavy and suffocating. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and the faint glow of the Christmas tree lights flickered as though struggling to stay alive. The figure raised its arm, pointing directly at me, and for a moment I thought I saw its face. It wasn't human, its features were twisted, wrong, its hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light. The bell rang again, louder this time, the sound vibrating through my chest like a physical force. And then it was gone. The room was empty, the air still, the only sound the faint hum of the Christmas lights. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I stared at the spot where the figure had stood, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The bell's chime still echoed in my ears, its haunting melody lingering long after the sound itself had faded. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, sent a jolt of fear through me. The shadows on the walls seemed darker, deeper, and every flicker of the lights felt like a warning. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, a weight that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. As dawn broke, I finally mustered the courage to leave the house. The yard was empty, the snow undisturbed, save for a single set of footprints leading from the porch to the edge of the woods. My stomach churned as I stared at them, the memory of the figure's gaze burning in my mind. The bell's chime echoed faintly in my ears, a haunting reminder of the night before. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew one thing for certain: it wasn't done with me yet. The morning light did little to ease my dread. The house was colder than ever, the silence inside it heavy and unnatural. I had slept for maybe an hour, if I'd slept at all. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, had kept me on edge, my nerves stretched to the breaking point. Even now, with the sun creeping through the curtains, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The footprints in the snow were still there, leading from the edge of the woods to the back porch. I stood at the window, staring at them, my breath fogging the glass. There were no new prints, no sign of movement, but the memory of that figure, its hollow eyes, the bell clutched in its hand, was burned into my mind. It wasn't just a person. It couldn't be. There was something deeply wrong about it, something that went beyond explanation. I spent the morning trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. I cleaned the house, rearranged the ornaments on the Christmas tree, even went through the stack of unopened mail on the kitchen counter. Anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I passed a window, I felt it, a weight, a presence, pressing against me from the other side of the glass. By midday, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat and boots and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The snow crunched beneath my feet as I followed the trail of footprints to the edge of the woods. The trees loomed tall and skeletal, their bare branches reaching toward the sky like bony fingers. The trail ended abruptly, just inside the tree line, the last print perfectly formed, as though whoever had made it had simply vanished. The woods were silent, unnaturally so. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just the faint whistle of the wind through the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the woods remained still, their shadows deep and uninviting. I turned back toward the house, my chest tight with unease. Whatever was happening, it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming to me. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I kept the curtains drawn, the doors locked, every light in the house turned on. The hours crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last, and by the time the sun set, I was exhausted. The air inside the house felt heavier now, the cold seeping through the walls no matter how high I turned up the heat. Even the Christmas lights seemed dimmer, their cheerful glow muted and faint. At exactly 11 o'clock, the bell rang again. This time, it was inside the house. My stomach dropped as the sound echoed through the silence, sharp and deliberate. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. The bell's chime was clear, unrelenting, carrying with it a weight that made my chest tighten. I moved slowly, my feet dragging as I crept toward the hallway. The shadows on the walls twisted and stretched, their shapes unnatural, shifting with every step I took. The bell rang again, the sound coming from the living room now. My heart pounded as I turned the corner, the glow of the Christmas tree casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. The figure was standing by the tree. It was taller than before, its form impossibly thin, its edges blurred, as though it didn't fully exist in this world. The bell in its hand swayed gently, the sound ringing out with a haunting clarity that echoed through the room. Its head tilted slightly, the motion slow and deliberate, as though it was studying me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The weight of its presence pinned me in place, my chest tightening with every second that passed. The figure raised its arm, pointing toward the fireplace. And for a moment, I thought I saw its face. It wasn't human. Its features were twisted, wrong, its hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light that seemed to pierce through me. The bell rang again, louder this time, and the figure stepped closer. My legs finally obeyed, and I stumbled backward, my hands fumbling for the edge of the doorframe as I retreated into the hallway. The figure didn't follow, but its gaze was unrelenting, its hollow eyes burning into my back as I fled. I locked myself in the bedroom, the door slamming shut behind me, my hands trembling as I shoved a chair under the doorknob. The bell's chime still echoed in my ears, faint but unyielding, like a heartbeat that wasn't my own. The air in the room was freezing now, my breath fogging with every exhale, the shadows on the walls twisting and writhing like living things. And then the knocking started. It was soft at first, a gentle tap-tap against the door. But it grew louder, more insistent, each knock sending a jolt of fear through me. I pressed myself against the wall, my chest heaving, my mind racing. The knocking stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. The doorknob rattled. My heart leapt into my throat as I watched it twist, the chair beneath it creaking as though something was testing the lock. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, growing darker, deeper, until they swallowed the faint glow of the bedside lamp. The doorknob stilled, but the sense of dread only grew, pressing against me like a weight I couldn't escape. The bell rang again. This time, it came from inside the room. The bell's chime was deafening, reverberating through the room as though the walls themselves were ringing. My breath caught in my throat, my chest tightening as the sound filled the air. It wasn't coming from outside, or even the hallway. It was here, inside the room. The shadows on the walls seemed to ripple and shift with the sound, their shapes twisting into forms I couldn't comprehend. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But there was nowhere to go. The room was impossibly cold now, my breath fogging with each shallow exhale. The bell rang again, the sound sharper this time, closer. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source, and then I saw it. The figure was standing in the corner. It wasn't the shadowy silhouette I'd seen before. Now it was fully formed, its features sharp and horrifyingly real. Its skin was pale and stretched too tightly over its bones, its hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light. The bell in its hand gleamed faintly, its surface worn and tarnished, the sound it made cutting through the silence like a blade. It tilted its head, its gaze locking onto mine, and for a moment, the air left my lungs. I couldn't look away, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Its presence filled the room, heavy and suffocating, pressing against me from all sides. The bell rang again, and the figure raised its free hand, pointing directly at me. "It's your turn." The words weren't spoken, not in the way I'd expected. They echoed in my mind, sharp and relentless, each syllable driving deeper into my thoughts like a splinter. My hands trembled as I backed away, the edge of the bed catching the back of my knees and sending me stumbling. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, the sound of the bell growing louder with each step. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything other than sit there frozen in terror. But my body refused to obey. The air in the room was thick, oppressive, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. The figure stopped a few feet from me, its hollow eyes burning into mine. It raised the bell, holding it high above its head, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The sound that followed wasn't a chime. It was a scream, a horrible, guttural wail that tore through the silence, filling the room with a sound so raw and unnatural that it made my ears ring. The shadows on the walls pulsed with the sound, stretching and twisting until they seemed to consume the room entirely. The figure loomed over me, its hollow eyes glowing brighter, and then everything went dark. Diablo. When I woke, the world was silent. The cold was gone, replaced by an oppressive heat that made it hard to breathe. I opened my eyes slowly, my vision swimming, and found myself lying on the floor of the living room. The Christmas tree lights flickered weakly, their glow casting strange, jagged shadows across the walls. The bell was gone. The figure was gone. But the sense of dread remained, heavier than ever. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs shaking, and stumbled toward the front door. The air outside was still and heavy, the snow untouched and glistening faintly under the moonlight. But something was wrong. The woods were darker than before, their shadows deeper, and the silence was absolute. No wind, no creaking branches, no distant hum of life. Just silence. I turned back toward the house, and that's when I saw it. My reflection in the window wasn't mine. The face staring back at me was twisted, its features hollow and wrong, its eyes glowing faintly with the same unnatural light as the figure. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, but the reflection didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its head tilting slowly to one side as though studying me. The bell rang again. This time, it came from the woods. I turned toward the sound, my chest tightening as I saw the lights. Dozens of them, flickering faintly between the trees like distant candles. They moved slowly, weaving between the branches, growing brighter with each passing moment. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the edge of the yard, toward the trail of footprints that led into the darkness. The bell rang again, louder this time, and the light stopped. The shadows around me deepened, the air growing colder with each step I took. The world seemed to fade, the edges of my vision blurring until there was nothing left but the light, the sound of the bell, and the overwhelming weight of the presence that had followed me from the house. When I reached the edge of the woods, the lights flared, their glow illuminating the figure standing at the center of the clearing. It wasn't alone. There were others now, their forms indistinct, their hollow eyes burning with the same unnatural light. They stood in a circle, their bells swaying in perfect unison, their chimes echoing through the stillness like a heartbeat. The figure in the center raised its hand, the bell in its grasp, ringing out one final time. The sound was deafening, consuming everything, and as the light flared brighter, I felt the world fall away. The last thing I saw was the glow of the bells, their haunting melody filling my mind as the darkness swallowed me whole. It began with a box, small, unassuming, wrapped in thick brown paper and tied with a frayed red ribbon. When I first found it on my doorstep, nestled in a drift of fresh snow, I assumed it was a misplaced delivery. It wasn't unusual for packages to go astray in our sleepy little town, especially during the chaotic holiday season. But there was no address, no sender's name, just a tag, handwritten in delicate cursive. Do not open before midnight. I stared at it for a long moment, the cold biting through my slippers as the snowflakes fell softly around me. Something about the box didn't feel right. It wasn't just the odd timing or the lack of a sender. It was the weight of it, the way the air around it seemed heavier, colder, as though the box itself was pulling the warmth from the world. But curiosity won out, as it always does. I brought it inside. The heat from the fireplace did little to warm me as I set the box on the coffee table and sat down across from it. The Christmas tree lights twinkled cheerfully in the corner, their colors casting soft patterns across the walls. It was a picture-perfect holiday evening, except for the gnawing unease that the box brought with it. I couldn't look away. It sat there, silent and unyielding, like it was waiting for something. The tag's instruction echoed in my mind, "Do not open before midnight." I glanced at the clock. It was barely 8 p.m. 4 hours to go. I told myself to leave it alone, to let it sit there untouched until morning. But as the minutes ticked by, the air in the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer. The box hadn't moved, but it felt closer somehow, its presence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't ignore. Finally, I gave in. My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon, the fibers brittle and frayed, as though they had been tied decades ago. The paper tore easily, revealing a small wooden box underneath, its surface carved with intricate patterns of swirling frost. The craftsmanship was stunning, almost hypnotic, the details so fine they seemed to shimmer in the firelight. There was no latch, just a simple lid that lifted away with surprising ease. Inside was a snow globe. At first glance, it was beautiful, an idyllic winter scene encased in glass. A tiny village nestled in a valley, its streets dusted with snow, the windows of its little houses glowing faintly with golden light. The details were exquisite, every tree, every rooftop crafted with meticulous care. But as I stared closer, something about it began to unsettle me. The layout of the village, the arrangement of the houses, it was familiar. Too familiar. It was my town. The church steeple in the center, the winding main street, the rows of houses lining the hill. I recognized it all. Even the little gas station on the edge of town, its tiny red roof tilted slightly to one side. There was no mistaking it. Someone had recreated my town in perfect, eerie detail. But why? And how? My breath fogged the glass as I turned the snow globe in my hands, searching for any kind of clue, any sign of who might have sent it. The underside of the wooden base was blank, no markings or labels to hint at its origin. When I shook it gently, the snow inside swirled and danced, glittering faintly as it settled over the miniature village. And then I saw it. A figure. It was small, barely noticeable at first, standing on the street just outside one of the houses. My house. A tiny figure cloaked in black, its head bowed, its hands clasped in front of it. I leaned closer, squinting at the glass, trying to make out the details, but the more I stared, the less I could see. Its edges blurred, its form indistinct, like a shadow that refused to stay still. I set the snow globe down, my hands trembling, my chest tight with a sense of dread I couldn't explain. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the only sound in the room, but it did nothing to dispel the cold that seemed to radiate from the globe. I told myself it was just a coincidence, a harmless decoration sent by someone with a flair for the dramatic. But deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right. As the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The snow globe sat on the coffee table, its tiny village bathed in the glow of the Christmas tree lights. I tried to ignore it, burying myself in a book, turning up the TV, anything to drown out the unease. But every time I glanced at it, the figure seemed closer. At exactly midnight, the lights flickered. It wasn't a power surge. It wasn't the wind. The air in the room shifted, heavy and cold, the fire sputtering in the hearth as the shadows on the walls twisted and stretched. The snow globe glowed faintly, a soft, pale light emanating from its center, illuminating the tiny village within. I leaned forward, my breath catching in my throat as I peered inside. The figure was gone. The streets of the tiny village were empty, the golden light in the windows dimming as the glow from the snow globe grew brighter. My pulse quickened as I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, searching for the figure. But it was nowhere to be found. The snow inside swirled violently, the tiny flakes whipping through the air like a blizzard, obscuring the village from view. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it. A knock. The knock echoed through the house, sharp and deliberate, breaking the suffocating silence that had settled over the room. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. My first instinct was to dismiss it, maybe a branch tapping against the side of the house, or the wind catching the shutters. But the snow outside was still, the air too calm for that kind of explanation. I didn't move at first, my body frozen in place, my hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The snow globe on the coffee table glowed faintly, its swirling storm finally beginning to settle. The tiny village inside came into view once more, but it wasn't the same. Something had changed. The lights in the houses were dimmer now, their golden glow reduced to a faint flicker. And then I saw it. Movement. A single tiny figure stood in the middle of the main street, its back turned to me. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass as I tried to make out the details. It wasn't the same cloaked figure I'd seen before. This one was smaller, its shape more childlike. It stood motionless, its head tilted slightly to one side, as though it was listening for something, or someone. The knock came again, louder this time. My heart jumped, the sound reverberating through the stillness like a gunshot. I forced myself to my feet, the room spinning slightly as I moved toward the front door. My footsteps were heavy, each step sending a jolt of fear through me as I approached. The hallway felt longer than usual, the shadows on the walls stretching unnaturally in the faint glow of the Christmas lights. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the lock, my palm slick with sweat, despite the freezing air. The knock didn't come again, but the silence that followed was worse. It pressed against me, thick and suffocating, amplifying every creak of the house, every shaky breath I took. Finally, I mustered the courage to peek through the peephole. There was no one there. The porch was empty, the snow untouched save for a faint, narrow trail of footprints leading away from the door. They were small, almost childlike, disappearing into the darkness beyond the glow of the porch light. My stomach churned as I stared at them, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who had been here? And where had they gone? I locked the door tightly, double-checking the deadbolt before retreating back to the living room. The snow globe sat where I'd left it, its glow dimming now, but the unease it brought with it was stronger than ever. I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, the size of them, the way they seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Something about them felt wrong. I sat down heavily on the couch, my hands trembling as I reached for the snow globe. The village inside was still now. The storm settled, the tiny houses standing silent and dark. The childlike figure was gone, the streets empty once more. But as I turned the globe in my hands, a chill ran down my spine. There, in the shadow of the church steeple, was the cloaked figure, watching, waiting. The hours crawled by, each one stretching into eternity. I couldn't sleep, couldn't bring myself to look away from the snow globe for too long. Every so often, I thought I saw movement inside, a flicker of light in one of the houses, the faintest suggestion of a shadow crossing the street. But whenever I looked closer, it was gone. At exactly 3 a.m., the knock came again. This time, It was at the back door. My heart stopped. The sound was softer than before, but no less deliberate. I turned slowly, my eyes fixed on the darkened hallway that led to the kitchen. The snow globe glowed faintly in my hands, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. I didn't want to move, didn't want to confirm what I already knew. But something stronger than fear pulled me to my feet, carrying me toward the source of the sound. The kitchen was cold, the air sharp and biting, as though the heat had been sucked from the room. The back door was shrouded in darkness, the faint outline of frost creeping along the edges of the glass. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath fogging the air as I waited for the knock to come again. But it didn't. Instead, the handle turned. The sound was slow, deliberate, the metal creaking softly as it twisted under an unseen hand. My chest tightened, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there frozen in fear. The lock held, the deadbolt unmoving, but the weight of whatever was on the other side pressed against the door like a living thing. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The air in the room shifted, the heaviness lifting slightly as the frost on the glass began to recede. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before finally forcing myself to move. My hands shook as I reached for the curtain, pulling it aside just enough to peer through the glass. There were no footprints this time, no sign that anyone, or anything, had been there. The yard was still, the snow unbroken, the shadows of the trees stretching long and jagged under the faint light of the moon. But as I turned to close the curtain, something caught my eye. The snow globe on the kitchen counter. I hadn't brought it here. It sat there, glowing faintly, its light pulsing softly like a heartbeat. The village inside had changed again. The houses were dark now, their windows shattered, the streets littered with tiny twisted shapes that I couldn't bring myself to focus on. And there, in the center of the main street, was the cloaked figure. Closer than ever, the glow from the snow globe pulsed faintly, casting an eerie, rhythmic light across the darkened kitchen. I couldn't look away. The tiny village inside was no longer pristine or idyllic. It was ruined, the streets littered with debris, the houses broken and dark. The figure stood at the center of it all, its cloaked form unmoving, its hollow gaze somehow palpable even through the glass. The air in the kitchen felt heavier now, colder, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. My hands trembled as I reached for the snow globe, my fingers brushing against the icy surface of the glass. The light within flared briefly, and for a moment I thought I heard something, distant and faint, like the sound of footsteps crunching through snow. I pulled back sharply, my breath hitching as the glow from the globe dimmed once more. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and this time they weren't faint. They echoed through the house, deliberate and steady, coming from somewhere beyond the kitchen door. My stomach twisted as I turned toward the sound, the shadows on the walls seeming to ripple with each step. I didn't want to move, didn't want to confirm what I already knew. But the footsteps didn't stop, each one measured and precise, drawing closer with an unrelenting rhythm that made my chest tighten. My hands gripped the edge of the counter, the wood cold and unyielding beneath my fingers as I forced myself to take a step forward. The hallway was darker than it should have been, the faint glow of the Christmas tree lights barely penetrating the oppressive shadows. The footsteps had stopped now, but the silence they left behind was worse. It was thick, suffocating, pressing against my ears like a physical force. My breath fogged the air as I moved closer, the floorboards creaking softly beneath my weight. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, cloaked in shadow, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the space with a weight that made it hard to breathe. My chest tightened as its head tilted slightly to one side, the motion slow and deliberate, as though it was studying me. The snow globe in the kitchen flared again, its light pulsing brightly enough to cast faint, flickering shadows against the walls. The figure didn't react, but its edges seemed to blur, its form shifting subtly as though it wasn't entirely solid. My legs felt like lead, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my breath shallow and ragged as the figure raised an arm. It pointed, not at me, but at the snow globe. The gesture was slow, deliberate, the weight of its meaning sinking into my chest like a stone. The globe's light pulsed again, brighter this time, the ruined village inside illuminated with an unnatural clarity. The tiny figure in the center of the street began to move, its cloaked form gliding silently through the twisted remains of the town. It stopped in front of a house, the one that mirrored mine, and turned to face me. The figure in the hallway lowered its arm, its head tilting again as though waiting for me to act. My legs moved before I could think, carrying me back to the kitchen, back to the snow globe. The light inside had grown steadier now, its glow casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. My hands shook as I reached for it, the glass cold and unyielding beneath my fingers. As soon as I touched it, the room around me seemed to shift. The shadows deepened, stretching across the walls like living things, their edges curling and twisting in unnatural patterns. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath burning my lungs as though I were standing outside in the middle of a blizzard. The snow globe's light flared one last time, blinding and all-consuming, and then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the kitchen anymore. The world around me was white, endless and unbroken, the snow stretching in every direction like a frozen ocean. The sky above was gray, heavy with clouds that hung low and oppressive, their weight pressing against me from all sides. The air was silent, unnaturally so, not even the faintest whisper of wind to break the stillness. I turned slowly, my boots crunching softly against the snow, and saw the village. It wasn't a tiny replica anymore. It was full-sized, its houses standing silent and empty beneath the heavy sky. The streets were just as I'd seen them in the snow globe, littered with debris and twisted remnants of whatever life had once existed here. And at the center of it all was the figure. It stood motionless in the middle of the main street, its back turned to me, its cloak billowing faintly despite the lack of wind. My chest tightened as I took a hesitant step forward, the snow crunching loudly beneath my feet. The figure didn't react, didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, a weight that pressed against me with every step I took. As I got closer, I saw the other figures. They were scattered throughout the village, their forms indistinct and blurred, as though they were caught between this world and something else. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, but their hollow gazes burned into me, unblinking and unrelenting. The closer I got to the center of the village, the heavier the air became, each step harder than the last. When I finally reached the figure, it turned. Its face was obscured, its features hidden beneath the shadow of its hood, but its presence was undeniable, a force that seemed to seep into my very being, chilling me to the core. It raised an arm, pointing past me, and when I turned to look, I saw it. A house. My house. It stood at the edge of the village, its windows dark, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. But it wasn't empty. A faint, flickering light glowed from within, pulsing softly like the heartbeat of something alive. My stomach churned as I turned back to the figure, its hollow gaze fixed on me. The message was clear. The house stood like a monument at the edge of the ruined village, its silhouette stark against the endless gray sky. I could feel its pull, an invisible force that wrapped around my chest and drew me closer with each passing moment. The faint glow in its windows pulsed softly, a steady rhythm that matched the beat of my own heart. It wasn't just a light, it was alive, watching, waiting. The figure behind me didn't move, but its presence loomed large, an unspoken command pressing me forward. The air was colder now, each breath burning in my lungs, and the snow beneath my feet felt strange, yielding and soft like ash. My legs trembled as I took a step toward the house, then another, the weight of the silence around me almost unbearable. As I reached the front door, I hesitated. The wood was warped and splintered, the once bright paint faded to a dull, lifeless gray. I could hear something faint from within, soft and rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock, but slower, heavier. My hand hovered over the handle, my fingers numb from the cold, as the pulsing light from inside grew brighter, spilling through the cracks in the wood like molten gold. I pushed the door open. The light flared, momentarily blinding, and I had to shield my eyes as I stepped inside. The air was thick with a strange metallic smell, sharp and biting, and the faint ticking sound grew louder, echoing off the walls. As my vision adjusted, I realized the room was empty. No furniture, no decorations, just bare walls and a floor covered in a fine layer of frost. But in the center of the room stood something that made my stomach twist. It was the snow globe, bigger now, almost the size of a small table, its surface glowing faintly as the storm inside raged on. The village within was more ruined than ever, its streets choked with debris. The tiny houses collapsed into heaps of splintered wood and shattered glass. The cloaked figure stood at the center of it all, motionless, its head tilted upward, as though looking at something I couldn't see. The ticking sound grew louder, sharper, and I realized it wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from the snow globe. I stepped closer, my breath fogging the air as I leaned over the glass, the storm inside swirling violently. The figure in the globe moved suddenly, its head snapping toward me, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding as its hollow gaze burned through the glass. The light inside the house dimmed, and for a moment everything was still. Then, from somewhere deep within the walls, I heard it, a low, guttural whisper, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but the sound carried a weight that sent chills down my spine. The words weren't clear, but the intent was. It wanted me to look deeper, to see what lay beyond the storm. The snow globe began to shake, its glow pulsing erratically as the storm inside grew fiercer. The walls of the house creaked and groaned, the frost spreading across the floor in jagged veins that reached toward me. My feet moved on their own, carrying me closer to the globe, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. When I reached it, the storm stilled. The village inside was gone, replaced by a single image, a door. It was identical to the one I had just stepped through, down to the splintered wood and the faint glow spilling through its cracks. But this door was different. It wasn't just a part of the globe. It was alive, pulsing faintly with that same golden light, its surface shifting and rippling like water. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it was coming from the door inside the globe. My hand moved before I could stop it, reaching for the glass, my fingers brushing against its icy surface. The moment I touched it, the room around me dissolved. I was standing in a hallway. It stretched endlessly in both directions, its walls covered in a strange, glistening frost that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. The air was heavy, thick with the metallic smell I'd noticed earlier, and the floor beneath my feet was soft and cold, like packed snow. The ticking sound was louder now, echoing through the hallway with a steady, unrelenting rhythm. Ahead of me, at the far end of the hallway, was another door. It was the same as the one in the snow globe, its surface warped and shifting, the faint glow spilling through its cracks, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The whispering was louder here, the words still indistinct but carrying a weight that made my chest ache. I didn't want to move, didn't want to go any closer. But the pull was stronger now, an invisible force dragging me forward. As I approached the door, the light behind it grew brighter, almost blinding, and the frost on the walls seemed to pulse in time with the ticking sound. My hands shook as I reached for the handle, the metal freezing against my skin. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. I opened the door. The door opened soundlessly, spilling a wave of golden light into the hallway. It was warm at first, almost comforting, a stark contrast to the frigid air that had surrounded me moments before. But as I stepped through, the warmth faded, replaced by a deep, suffocating chill that seeped into my skin. The light pulsed faintly, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the void. I found myself standing in a circular room, its walls smooth and unbroken, glistening with the same frost that lined the hallway. The air here was heavier, denser, pressing against me from all sides. In the center of the room stood the snow globe, larger now, its glass surface shimmering faintly as the storm inside raged on. The ticking sound was deafening here, reverberating through the walls, the floor, the very air. And then I saw them. Figures began to materialize in the shadows, their forms indistinct at first, shifting and blurring as though they weren't fully part of this world. They were silent, their movements slow and deliberate, their hollow eyes fixed on me. Each one carried something, a bell, a lantern, a small withered branch, and as they stepped closer, their features sharpened. Their faces were wrong, twisted, familiar. My chest tightened as recognition washed over me. These were the people I had known, neighbors, friends, the kind of faces you pass on the street without a second thought. But weren't themselves anymore. Their skin was pale and stretched, their eyes empty and cold. The whispering returned, soft at first, but growing louder, their voices weaving together in a haunting, discordant melody. The snow globe pulsed again, and the storm inside stilled. The ruined village was gone now, replaced by a single figure standing alone in the center of the glass. It was cloaked, its form impossibly tall and thin, its head bowed as though in silent prayer. The frost on the walls seemed to draw toward it, the light from the globe growing brighter as the figure slowly lifted its head. The ticking stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy and oppressive, pressing against my ears like a physical force. The figure inside the globe began to move, its steps slow and deliberate, each one sending ripples through the glass. My breath hitched as it turned toward me, its hollow gaze piercing through the frost, through the walls, through me. And then it stepped out of the globe. The glass shattered soundlessly, the shards dissolving into a fine, glittering mist that swirled around the room. The figure stood before me now, its cloak billowing faintly despite the stillness of the air. It didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the room with a weight that made it hard to breathe. It raised a hand, its long skeletal fingers extending toward me. The frost on the walls pulsed once, twice, and then began to creep across the floor, curling around my feet, climbing up my legs. My body felt heavy, rooted to the spot, as though the frost itself was holding me in place. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and for the first time, I understood. Choose. The word echoed in my mind, sharp and relentless, cutting through the fear like a blade. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. My gaze shifted to the snow globe, or what was left of it. The figure inside was gone, but in its place was an image. My house, its windows glowing faintly, its door slightly ajar. The meaning was clear. It wanted me to choose between this place and the life I had left behind. But there was a catch. There always is. The whispers grew louder, their words weaving together into something coherent. A single, unrelenting truth. I couldn't leave alone. A price had to be paid. A life for a life. The frost climbed higher, curling around my chest, pressing against my ribs as the weight of the choice settled over me. I couldn't go back without giving something, or someone, up. The faces in the shadows loomed closer now, their hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light. They didn't speak, but their message was clear. They had made their choice, and now it was my turn. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I turned back to the figure, its hand still extended, its hollow gaze unyielding. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed against its icy skin. The moment we touched, the world dissolved around me. When I woke, I was back in my living room. The fire had burned out, the room bathed in the faint glow of the Christmas tree lights. The snow globe sat on the coffee table, whole once more, its surface pristine, the village inside untouched. The storm was gone, the streets empty, the houses glowing softly with golden light. But the air in the room was heavy, thick with the lingering chill of something I couldn't explain. I stood slowly, my legs shaky, my breath fogging the air despite the warmth of the house. The frost on the windows had melted, leaving behind faint, jagged patterns that almost looked like writing. I didn't need to read them to know what they said. The choice I had made would stay with me, etched into my mind like the frost on the glass. As I turned to leave the room, my gaze fell on the snow globe one last time. The cloaked figure was there, standing in the center of the village, its hollow eyes fixed on me. And then, as the faint chime of a clock echoed through the house, it moved. The light inside the snow globe flickered, dimmed, and then went out.